Thank you for joining us for Working Through the Word, a ministry of the Richmond Church of Christ.
I put it on my tie, walked to the front of the building. I turned around and started talking, and no sound came out, just like this morning. Well, I said, well, that's not good. So I looked at that little box, had one button, said no. Well, I didn't fall off the truck yesterday, so I knew better than to turn it to no. And somebody said, well, if you'll turn it over, no says on, upside down. And so if there's ever a microphone problem, it's always my fault. I'm not very technologically sophisticated. So this verse this young man read for us, if you start looking at the book of Ephesians, and this morning in the limited time that we have, we're going to try to look at the book of Ephesians from kind of a view of 5,000 feet. When you read your New Testament, please understand that those individual books are letters. Those letters did not contain chapters, and those letters did not contain verses. Those have been added for us to have quick reference. And so when you start doing your Bible study, you should probably look at the book and try to get a holistic view. And then once you get the macro view, start doing the deep dive into the micros. And so if you look at the book of Ephesians, and the theme for our youth rally this weekend was being different kind of people, being the kind of people God wants us to be. The particular phrasing they used was for us to be a peculiar people. Well, God's intention has always been to do something with people. If you read the first chapter of Ephesians, and just as you go through what in the English Bible we call chapter 1, if you'll just look for intentional language, God's purpose, God's will, God chose, God predetermined according to His will. When you read the New Testament and you read the word predestination, don't freak out. When you read the word predestination, think in your mind predetermined. It wasn't that God said, I'm going to make you do this, but God established in His determinate foreknowledge that if this, then this, so you are predetermined for that. I'm going to send the Messiah. He's going to die. He's going to resurrect. And anyone who believes in Him and is baptized will become my children. That's predetermination, not predestination. And so as you read that God has a will, God has a purpose, the very last verse in chapter 1 says that He chose Him to be head over all things to the church, the fullness of Him who fulfills everything in every way. This thing that God had intended to do with people. And by the way, God intended it before the foundation of the world. Ephesians chapter 3 verse 11 will tell us that it was God's eternal purpose. Before God created the first Adam, A-D-A-M or A-T-O-M, He said, I'm going to send my Son and I'm going to accomplish something with humanity. And the fulfillment of that, the fullness of what God wanted to do with people is found in this thing we're participating in this morning, and that's called church. Now, what we're doing in this building is not church. What we're doing in this building is worship. What you do out there is church. Because we are God's special, chosen people to accomplish something. And so He says, we're going to do this thing with people. And then what the young man read for us basically is the outline of Ephesians, that the cross is the plus sign of the universe. He's going to take two different groups of people, the Jews and the Gentiles, people with the law, people without the law, people who believed in circumcision, people who didn't have to worry about it. He's going to make out of those two one new man, and then He's going to take those united peoples and He's going to reconcile them back to God because of the blood of the cross. The cross is the plus sign of the universe, connecting God and people and people and people. And the mystery that God had revealed through the prophets and the Old Testament guys, and even through some of the apostles, He said He didn't reveal it to everyone. And there's a verse in here that says that the angels desired to look into these things. The angels knew God was up to something, but He didn't tell them what it was. And that Greek word for desired to look into it is like you get on the ground and you look through the dirt trying to find something. And we're living in the time where what God had intended to do with people is happening. Because we are living in the dispensation of the cross, God and people and people and people. And so as he talks about what God's intention was to take these two desperate groups of people, these two different people, people who are far off, and bring them in and to create a unity of God and people and people and people, that's the purpose of Christianity. And if we're going to be those different kind of people, if we're going to be part of that new humanity, there's some things that we have to understand, and Paul outlines that pretty good. You can look through the book of Ephesians, and if you wanted to do just a fun Bible study, go through the book of Ephesians, and every time he talks about before versus after, before versus after. This is what you are, this is what you were. This is what you were, this is what you are. This is what you didn't have, this is what you do have. And you can do a great outline of Ephesians just looking at the before and after pictures, but there's also a thing that he does where he uses this phrase 5 times. He'll use the word walk. In fact, he'll say in chapter 2, he said, we're his workmanship. We're this project. We're this thing that God put together and built and carved and sculpted and assembled. And he put us together to do good works beforehand so that we should walk in them. And as you run through the book of Ephesians, there's 5 distinct passages that use that phrase. This is how you should walk. And so we'll hit those real quick, and then we'll kind of put a bow on our weekend. The first thing that he says to do is in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, he says, as the prisoner of the Lord, I beg you that you walk worthy of the calling wherewith you were called. God called us to do something. God called us to be something, and God called us something. He says, now, I'm begging you that when you answer that call, that your behavior, your walk is worthy, is consistent. It lives up to that. We have titles that we live by. We're dads, we're sons, we're brothers, we're sisters, we're mothers, we're fathers, we're friends, we're neighbors. And sometimes people have titles and they don't live up to them. Now, I'm going to give you a guilty confession. I don't like to tell you my name at a restaurant. When I go to McDonald's and I order my double cheeseburger and my small fries and a Diet Coke, I want them to give me a number and hand me my food. I don't want them to go, can I have a name for the order? I'm not adopting anybody. We're not picking out curtains. I want my number. I want to get my cheeseburger, and I want to go sit down. I've got a friend of mine, and he always gives the waitress the name that she's wearing. And he's a tall fella. He's got dark complexion. He got dark hair. And may I have a name for the order? Natasha. And he'll lay it on him with a straight face. And then you're sitting in a restaurant. Natasha, your order's ready. And this dude gets up and walks across the restaurant. It's pretty funny. I'm not brave enough to do that. I've got another friend, and every time he's at a restaurant, he tells them his name is Jay Sanchez. And this is a big guy. He played football for Swanee University of the South. And he'll stand there at the counter and have a name for the order, Jay Sanchez. And so I sat down with him one day and said, okay, Larry, what's up with Jay Sanchez? And so Larry tells me this story that he's walking through the mall, him and some of his friends. And you know, the mall has those little cutouts in it where the mall walkers can walk. And he said there's a guy standing there, and he's got these 3 girls, and they're not really pinned, but by the way this guy's standing, he's kind of using his body language to herd them. And he said I could tell by the way he's gesturing and by some stances that there's a confrontation going on here. And Larry's a nice guy. Larry has daughters. Larry has granddaughters. So he eases up to this fella. He goes, excuse me, sir, is there a problem? And this guy goes, back off. I'm a federal marshal. And he shows Larry this badge. And Larry goes, well, that's really strange because your badge doesn't look like my badge because Larry is a federal marshal. And the 2 dudes with Larry are federal marshals, and they're part of the Federal Marshal Fugitive Task Force team. And this yahoo was running around the mall acting like a federal marshal and harassing girls. He went to UT Chattanooga and taught for 2 hours in their criminal justice program on how to be a federal marshal. He's not a federal marshal. He's now in federal prison, by the way. And his name was Jay Sanchez. And so Larry imitates Jay Sanchez because Jay Sanchez imitated them. Well, Paul says, I want you to walk worthy. When you walk up to somebody and you go, I'm a Christian, they go, your badge is fake. That's not authentic. That's not real. I've seen the way you treat your wife. I see the way you treat your kids. I see the way you obey your parents. Your badge is fake. Paul says, I want you to walk worthy. And really when he talks about walking worthy, the majority of chapter 4, we don't have time to deep dive, but the majority of chapter 4 is just what it means to be unified. Because God's people have unity. And listen to what he says about God and people, people and people. I want you to walk worthy And I want you to walk in lowliness and gentleness with long suffering, bearing with one another, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. He says the marker for you being a special person, the marker for you being a unique person is that you maintain unity. And you notice what he talks about unity was not our ability to be perfect, but our understanding that other people could be imperfect. With lowliness and meekness and gentleness and long suffering and bearing with one another. Hey, Paul says, listen, you got to understand, you were created with a capacity for imperfection. And everybody you know was created with the capacity for imperfection. And when you live up to that capacity, how should you react to people? You should not let it break you up. You should not let it destroy you. You should treat them with lowliness and gentleness, long suffering and bearing with one another. The idea of walking worthy of our calling is that we maintain unity, and it's basically that it's not my ability to be perfect, and I don't demand you to be perfect, but I recognize that it's part of your nature to be imperfect, and as a mature Christian, as a person of the cross, I get over it when you don't live up to that. And I'm the guy who maintains the unity, not you. And I don't know why we're shocked when imperfect people do imperfect things. You take an imperfect person and they marry an imperfect person, guess what you've got? You've got an imperfect relationship. And you have to work on that. You take an imperfect guy who worships at a church with imperfect people and you make him an elder, you've got an imperfect elder. But all of a sudden we think he gets that title, he's supposed to be perfect. Imperfect people live up to their capacity, and it's our job to deal with them with gentleness and lowliness and meekness and forbearance and forgiveness. First walk passage he's going to say is, I want you to walk worthy. Number 2, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17, he says, I say this in the Lord, and I testify to you that you should no longer work as the rest of the Gentiles walk. Not only do you walk worthy, you got to walk different. And we talked Friday night about a difference that makes no difference is no difference. If I claim that I'm a Christian, and yet from when I was not a Christian to when I became a Christian, if I still do some of the things I used to do, then I'm not walking worthy and I'm not walking differently. Notice what he says, I don't want you to walk like the rest of the Gentiles walk. They have gone and their understanding has been darkened. They've been alienated from God because of the ignorance of their heart and the blindness of their lives. Verse 22, put off then concerning your former conduct the old man that grows corrupt with deceitful lust. He says, I want you to walk worthy, but I also want you to realize that you walk different. When you became a Christian, when you signed up to be part of this thing that God is doing with people, you gave up some things that were part of your past. So walk worthy, walk different. And then in chapter 5, verse 1, he said, therefore be imitators of God as dear children and walk in love. Not only do I walk worthy, not only do I walk different, but I'm going to be a person who walks in love. And notice how he describes walking in love. This kind of shocked me when I looked at this. But fornication and uncleanliness and covetousness, let it not even be named among you, nor is fitting for the saints. No filthiness, no foolish talking, no coarse jesting, which is not fitting, but rather the giving of thanks. And know this, that no fornicator, unclean person, or covetous man who's an idolater has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ that is in God. He said, listen, I want you to walk in love, and love is the place where he camps out on ethical behavior. If you love people, you won't sin with them, and if you love people, you won't sin against them. The impetus for why I treat you the way I treat you is because I love you. And it's not that God has this arbitrary list of things you can't do. Everything God has ever said that controls our sexuality or things about interpersonal relationships, lying, cheating, coveting, stealing, all those things are based in good, healthy principles for how to get along with people. If you treat other people this way, it's bad for you and it's bad for them. So God's laws about ethics aren't arbitrary. They're rooted and sounded just in the idea of love. So Paul says, look, I want you to walk worthy. I want you to walk different. I want you to walk in love. And then when he goes on further, he tells his audience, he says, I want you to walk in light. Look at verse 8 of chapter 5. For you were once in darkness, but you are now light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. When you go out into the world of darkness, you go to work or you go to school or you go back to that neighborhood that you live in, you need to be a light in the darkness. And I don't know if you've ever been in pitch black dark, but in pitch black dark, a very tiny light makes a very big difference. And he said, I want you to walk in light. And notice, this is a really cool verse. Verse 9, he says, for the fruit of the Spirit is goodness, righteousness, and truth. Now, we've got a long list of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. He takes all those things and basically puts them in 3 buckets, good, right, and true. A fun family devotional you might do is sit down and say, all right, here's a page that is good, here's a page that is right, here's a page that is true. Now take love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, and see which page you could put those things on. Because he takes the fruit of the Spirit, the big list that we usually use, and he turns it into 3 things. If you're going to be a person who's different in your community, at your workplace, in your family, or in school, then the things that you do have to be good, right, and true. Hey, I'm about to do something with my date. Is it good, right, and true? I'm about to say something to my spouse. Is it good, right, and true? I'm about to post something on the interweb. Is it good, right, and true? I'm about to share something on Facebook. Is it good, right, and true? He said, if you basically recognize that everything you do either creates light in the darkness or just participates in the darkness, then you modify what you do by the simple standard of are you good, are you right, are you true? He says, so I want you to walk worthy. I want you to walk different. I want you to walk in love. I want you to walk in light. And walking in light means that you do things that are good, right, and true, and you find out what is acceptable to the Lord. So you know, when you think about, you know, there used to be those bracelets that said, what would Jesus do? Well, how about what would Jesus like? Can I do this and bring it to the table and sit down by Jesus with it? If Jesus were sitting beside me, could I look at it on my phone? Could I watch it on my iPad? Could I whisper it to somebody? Find out what is acceptable to the Lord, and you understand what it is to walk in light. So we walk worthy, we walk different, we walk in love, we walk in light. And then the last walk passage, he says, is verse 15, see then that you walk circumspectly. Now that's not a word that I typically use, but notice in context how you can understand what it says. I want you to walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. I want you to walk wise. And notice what he says a wise walker does. I want you to walk wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Don't be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. He says, when you get up every day, your agenda is not your agenda. Your agenda is the Lord's agenda. You wake up every day and say, okay, Lord, what is it you want me to do today? I've got a buddy named Chip Wallace, and he says he gets up every day and says, Lord, what are we doing today? The Lord gets to decide. It's like being married. Where are we going to eat? Okay? I'm traveling. My wife's not with me. Guess where I'm going to eat? Anywhere I want to. Okay? But when I'm with Miss Jackie, guess where we eat? Where she wants to. They told me where I wanted to eat on my birthday. My daughter came in from Georgia, said, Dad, I'm here to take you for lunch for your birthday. I said, well, great. Let's go to Crystal's. I love those little gut grenades. She said, you can't eat Crystals on your birthday. I said, why not? It's my birthday. She said, well, that's not, I'm going to spend some money on you, so let's go someplace nice. So I got told where I was going to eat on my birthday. Well, that's not the way you treat the Lord. You say, Lord, what is it you want to do today? And the Lord says, this is what we want to do. You don't want to do that. No. When God says, this is what my will is for you at home, at church, at school, in your neighborhood, I'm going to do what the will of the Lord is. Now, it's very interesting how he describes filling up the will of the Lord. He says, because do not be drunk with wine, because it is full of dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and in hymns and in spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks always to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. He says, when you understand what the will of the Lord is, you will fill your life up with the Spirit, not with spirits. It's a play on words. He said, look, you don't fill your life with wine, because when you fill your life with wine, it overflows into dissipation, debauchery, bad things. But when you fill your life with the Spirit, it overflows in praise and thanksgiving and singing. And the difference in being filled with the Spirit versus being filled with spirits is you make wise decisions. You don't get full of wine and make wise decisions. But when you're full of the Spirit, you make good decisions. And in fact, he's going to extrapolate on this, because not only does it overflow in praise and thanksgiving to God, it also overflows in submission. Look at verse 21. Not only are you singing and praying and having melody in your heart to the Lord, and you give thanks always for all things to God the Father, but you submit to one another out of your reverence for God. My relationship dynamic with you has very little to do with you. My relationship dynamic with you has everything to do with Christ. Because I run you through the Christ filter. And because I'm connected to Christ, this is how I treat people. Now, it really becomes this really super exponential strengthening thing when I go, I'm connected to Christ and you're connected to Christ. We have a mutual connection to Christ. And so my connection to Christ should overpower any other difference in our lives. And he says, when you submit to one another as you submit to the Lord, and you look at the rest of this and most of chapter 6, it involves husbands and wives, wives and husbands, parents and children, children and parents, workers and bosses and workers. Everything you can do as a human is affected by whether or not I'm walking in the wisdom of the Spirit. Because when it comes to that, I treat my wife like Christ treated the church. And if you've got a problem with these submission passages, please just simply understand that what Ephesians 5 teaches is that Jesus was submissive to the needs of the church. And in any relationship dynamic, the other person's needs always trump my rights. And so when you start talking about, hey, I've got a right to do this or be this or feel, what does the other person need? And when I submit to your needs, then I'll treat my wife like Christ treated the church. And then when my wife submits to my needs, she'll treat me like the church responded to Christ. And then there's a dynamic, husbands and wives, wives and husbands, parents and children, children and parents. And then notice what he says about bosses and workers. Verse 5 of chapter 6, bondservants, be obedient to your masters in the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, not with eye service as men pleasers, but because you're servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, and with goodwill doing service as to the Lord and not to men. He said, when you go to work tomorrow, pretend you're working for God. When you go to school tomorrow, pretend the algebra teacher's God. When you go to football practice, pretend the coach is God. And you practice and you play and you study and you work and you listen and you pay attention and you produce, not because these guys are watching you, not as eye service as men pleasers, but because you know that your real boss is Jesus. And when you live your life with the idea that I'm working for Jesus, then I'm walking in wisdom. And so Paul's going to say, hey, look, this is how you got to live as being called to be part of this new humanity. I want you to walk worthy. I want you to walk in love. I want you to walk different. I want you to walk in light. And I want you to walk wisely. And then as he closes his letter, he does this kind of abrupt change. Because he quits talking about walking and talks about standing. Finally, brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. And then he talks about this armor stuff, verse 14. Stand, girding your waist with truth and having the breastplate of righteousness and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, and take the shield of faith, which you can quench the fiery darts of the wicked one, and the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit. And you know, as a dude, I like that kind of stuff. I enjoyed being at Tom's house last night and looking at all those toys. I like guns. I like weapons. I like violence. I probably shouldn't, but I do. It's one of those things. You know, I taught my daughter martial arts. She had to learn 12 Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu moves before she could date. Nothing says no like a dislocated shoulder. I mean, it's just one of those cool things. And so I like that. And so when you read these passages, you know, you want to do a sermon on this, and you got a helmet and a breastplate. I've got body armor in my car. I've been a chaplain with a SWAT team for 32 years. I've got a helmet made out of Kevlar. I've got special boots. I've got a class 2 body armor. It'll take a 30-06 round at point blank range to the chest. It'll ruin your weekend, but it won't kill you. And I've got a belt, a battle belt that holds up my toys and my gear. And when you think about this passage, I've always had this vision of a Roman soldier. But as I learned more and more about the Roman soldiers in the first century, the Roman soldiers of the first century were police officers. They'd already conquered Jerusalem. They weren't at war. And when a Roman soldier stepped outside in the world that they owned, they didn't step outside in their blue jeans and their flip-flops. because they were in hostile territory. They were in enemy territory. And so when they stepped outside, they had a helmet and a breastplate and a belt and shoes and a shield and a sword. And it wasn't because they were at war with them, but because they were at war with them. Make a difference? So Jackie likes to travel, and Jackie's not super brave. We did a zip line in Hawaii one time, and I turned upside down and rode it. And I got to the end of it. I said, hey, I turned upside down. She said, hey, I opened my eyes once. And so she's not super brave. But if you give her a chance to take a picture, she can get real courageous. She loves to take photography. So we were in Alaska. And we looked at whales, and we looked at bears, and we'd flown over the glacier, and I'd chased eagles all over the place. And we're walking down, I think we're in Ketchikan, Alaska. And we're walking down this street, and there's a poster of a dude holding a starfish. She goes, hey, we need to do that. I said, baby, they're not going to let us hold starfish. He goes, I bet they will. I said, I bet they won't. That's just a picture. She said, go ask them. So I go in. I said, hey, yeah, you can hold a starfish. The starfish was the size of a large pizza. I said, okay, they said we could hold the starfish. The only problem is in order to do that, we have to snorkel. And we don't know how to snorkel. She said, they'll teach us. I said, baby, you don't understand. I don't want to learn to snorkel in Alaska. The water is cold. Well, guess what we did? Went snorkeling. So we drove out to this little place. They had this little tent set up, and you put on these neoprene suits. And let me just tell you, it was a little bit uncomfortably tight for me. Okay, I mean, I busted my lip putting the thing on. I'm trying to pull the sleeve up. I lose my grip. I pop myself in the head. I had the strange urge to fight crime. But here we go. We put this stuff on. They stuck this thing in my mouth, and they put these things over my face. 98.6 degree body temperature. I walk on land, I breathe air. And I'm in the cold Alaskan waters. And my head's underwater, and I can still breathe. And the water flows into that suit, and it traps it, and your body heat warms the water, and it insulates you. And so now I'm a land walker, an air breather. I got a 98.6 degree body temperature, but I'm in the water with my face below the surface, and I can still breathe air, and I'm warm, and my wife's taking pictures of starfish. See, when Paul talks about this Roman body armor, he's not talking about war. He's talking about a survival suit. I put this stuff on, and I went from my normal environment to an alien environment, and allowed me as a land walker and an air breather with a warm body to survive there. Paul says if you're a spiritual creature, if you're one of these people of God, and as a spiritual creature you have to live in the physical world, then you're going to need a belt, a breastplate, a helmet, some boots, a shield, and a sword. And it's not a warfare suit. It's a survival suit. Now, please listen carefully. I titled this lesson, Varsity Wrestling. I like to wrestle. One of my hobbies is self-defense. I teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at the police academy. But of all the things I've done in the world of martial arts, when I was in high school, I turned down a position on the wrestling team to be a youth minister. And I don't really regret it, but I regret it. Because of everything I've ever done, I've never been a varsity wrestler. There's this dude, he weighed 185 pounds and was tall, muscular. He was on the wrestling team. And on our wrestling team, they had these jackets, and the jackets had a ribbon, and then on the ribbon, you'd get a diaper pin. But a diaper pin stood for people you'd pinned in wrestling. And this dude had a rack of them. And he'd walk down the hallway with those massive shoulders and diaper pins. Boy, they were impressive. This dude was something else. And the difference between what I do, because I teach at the police academy, and I've got a mat in my garage, and I work with some guys from Eddie Bravo school. I've never done what this guy did, because this guy would practice on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays on a mat that was black with a gold circle and a yellow jacket on it, because we were the Oxford Yellow Jackets. And then on Fridays, they'd get on a bus and they'd go somewhere else. And he'd step out on a red mat with a white bulldog on it. Or he'd step out on a blue mat with a panther on it. But he'd be wearing his colors on the enemy's mat. That's varsity wrestling. See, I do it in a contained environment. I do it with people who want to learn. I do it with people who are my friends. This guy put on his uniform and stepped off of his mat and walked into a hostile territory, and wearing his colors, stepped onto the enemy's colors and was victorious. And varsity wrestling is when you go out into the world tomorrow, you're not here, you're there. And you're wearing your colors on their mat. And you're surviving because of your righteousness, your salvation, your truth, your peace, your faith, and the Word of God. But you're not at war with anybody. You're just trying to be a spiritual creature surviving in the physical world. And please, for the next 3 minutes, pay attention, and then I'll hush. The LGBTQ movement is not your enemy. The transgender folks are not your enemy. The atheistic professor at Eastern Kentucky is not your enemy. The humanistic psychologist is not your enemy. The people at the abortion clinic are not your enemy. They are victims of your enemy. And is incongruous with who we are as children of God if we are at war with them. God and people, people and people. Satan's already got them, but if he can get us to declare war on them and hate them and fight them, then not only does he have them, but he has us too. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. They're not a person on this planet I'm at war with. But we wrestle against principalities and against rulers of darkness and against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. See, in order to understand what it is to be a different kind of people, it's not that we're different just from other people, but we really understand that the people that don't get along with us and the people that are different from us, they're not our enemies. They are victims of our enemies. In 25 years as a practicing psychologist, 32 years as a police chaplain with a tough bunch of dudes, and I've seen my share of it. And as a minister for almost 40 years, I'd probably name you 6 people that I think I've come across that I would say that's just an evil person. The rest of them are just victims of evil. They're hurt and they're wounded and they're scared and they believe the lie. And if we declare war on them, we violate the principle of God and people and people and people. Because the people of God aren't out here trying to kill the people that aren't of God. The people of God are trying to bring those people back to God. God and people. People and people. So, how you walking? And what are you wearing while you're walking? And if that's not consistent with the principles of the New Testament, and you need to be a worthy walker, you need to walk in love, walk in light, walk in wisdom. We'd love to pray with you. If you're not in the Lord's army, so to speak, we'd love to baptize you, and we offer you the Lord's invitation this morning as you begin to walk for God. If we can help you, you can walk down this aisle while we stand, while we sing.
We hope that you enjoyed today's broadcast, brought to you by the Richmond Church of Christ. We are located at 1500 Lancaster Road in Richmond, Kentucky. We meet at 9 a.m. each Sunday morning for Bible class, followed by our morning worship service held at 10 a.m. Our Sunday evening service is held at 6 p.m. Our midweek Bible study is held on Wednesday at 7 p.m. If you are in the area, we would love to have you as our honored guest. Thanks for listening.